Hello, my twisted friends. My name is Shannon Page, and I would like to welcome you to Tuesday's Twisted Tales. Now, if you are interested and intrigued by true crime like I am, well, I would suggest hitting that like and subscribe button to join me on Tuesdays for another Twisted Tale. Oh man, last week covered John Gacy. I mean, that really is the case that just never ends. And I will probably circle back to Gacy as I continue to uncover, different connections, which is what brought me to do today's story. And this one I've avoided for many years because there really isn't a case file on him. And anything that we have on his past, of course, is from the people that knew him best or thought they did. And obviously, they didn't know that he was a sociopath. So everything that they say is, all this great, wonderful stuff. But I will have you know that it is a very, very twisted tale. You're going to see a lot of things in here that are going to remind you of last week's twisted tale of Gacy. Also very interesting. Now this one, however, this one, y'all, we're getting into Dean Corll, or as you may know him as the Candyman, or maybe it's the Pied Piper that you know him as. I know, already not good. When they have more than one name, it's not good. It's not good at all. Now, this one being real bad, extra twisted. So before we get into it, I do need to give you a warning, okay? This episode does contain sensitive material that may be triggering to some viewers. This includes crimes against children, violence, assault in a sexual matter towards children, and of course, murder. So viewer discretion, it is advised. All right, guys, now that that's all out of the way, let's start this twisted tale. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24th, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I mean, we got ourselves a little Christmas Eve baby here, guys. Now, he was the firstborn to his parents, Mary Emma Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll. Now, Corll's dad, he was a real strict dude, no nonsense kind of guy. And he was kind of hard on the couple's kids, okay? Their mama, though, Mary, she was a lot more lenient, didn't really do any disciplinary of any kind, even when the kids probably deserved it. She was fiercely protective of them. Now, their marriage, though, Emma's and Arnold's, their marriage is not that of fairy tales, let's say. They had a lot of quarreling between them, and, things just weren't good. So the couple would actually end up in divorce in 1946, which was just a few years after the couple's second son, Stanley, was born. And Mary, their mother, she would get full custody of the kids. And Mary then took her two boys and moved to Memphis, Tennessee. Well, Dean's father, Arnold, he was actually drafted into the Air Force there in Memphis right after the divorce. And so Mary, she thought, well, I'll move the boys to Memphis so that they can still, kind of have a relationship with their dad. Now, it's been said that Corll was a really shy kid, right? He was a serious child. He rarely socialized with other children, but he would show concern for the well-being of others. He was also a really sensitive young boy, and he did not do well with any form of criticism or rejection, which probably was brought on by his mom, thinking that he, walked on water and all. So Corll's parents, though, they would end up giving their relationship another go, and the couple would remarry in 1950. And at this time, they're going to move to Pasadena, Texas. But the marriage was again short-lived, and the couple would again divorce, and this takes place in 53. And Mary, again, she is going to retain custody of the boys. And of course, they're still allowed to see their father anytime that he's available, being in the military and all. Now, Mary, she would get married again, and this time to a traveling clock salesman. This guy's name is Jake West. And so now the family, they're going to move to a small town of Vidor, Texas, where Mary would give birth to a girl, and they name her Joyce West. And this is in 1955. So Corll is quite a bit older than his half-sister. Now, Mary and her new husband, they would start a small candy business that they ran out of their garage. Now, the young Corll, he would work night and day with the candy business, all while still attending school. Corll and his brother's job was to operate the candy making machines and then to package up the candy. And then their stepfather, he would take it on his clock route and sell along the way, with their biggest sales being in Houston, Texas. So this is, where the majority of their candy would be sold. Now, Corll, he's attending Vidor High School, and he would graduate in 1958. He was said to be a well-behaved guy and had satisfactory grades, but he was also a loner. He did occasionally date a few girls here and there in high school, but his main interest was being in the band, where he would play the trombone. Now, after graduation in the summer of 58, he and his family would move again, and this time to the northern outskirts there in Houston, Texas area. And this was because that is where most of the sales for the candy business were being generated. So they wanted to be closer to the city with the majority of the sales, right? They wanted to make as much money as they possibly could. And this is when they would actually open a candy store, and they would name it the Pecan Prince. And this is in 1960. Okay. Well, also 1960, at the request of his mother, Mary, she asked Corll to move to Yoder, Indiana, to live with his widowed grandma. So while living there, he does get involved with a local girl, and she apparently proposes to him, and he rejects this proposal in 1962. But it's a real bold move for a woman to make a proposal in this area. But I guess she was like, Corll, he's not moving things along in the relationship as fast as she would have liked. And so she took matters into her own hands. She pops the question, and she gets rejected. So right after this incident, Corll, he would just pack it up and return to Houston shortly after that whole thing went down. And he went right back to work for the family's candy company, which had moved to Houston Heights, Texas. And above the store there was like a small apartment. And so that is where Corll would move into. Now, Mary, she seems to have a problem with being married, because she and Jake would divorce in 1963, and she would have to open a new candy business, and this one she called the Corll Candy Company. Now, Corll, he would be appointed the vice president of the company, while his little brother, Stanley, was the company's appointed secretary or treasurer. And this is where things are going to start to get a little weird. So the store hired a bunch of teenagers to come in and work there at the candy company. And this one teenager had told Mary that, Corll was making advances towards him. And Mary, she fires the kid, because it's always the kid's fault, right? Nothing wrong with her son. It's you're the problem, so you got to go kind of thing. Now, anyhow, in 1964, Corll, he would end up being drafted into the military, okay? And he's assigned to Fort Polk there in Louisiana for basic training. He would later be assigned to Fort Benning in Georgia, where he received his training as a radio repair guy. And his permanent position, or assignment as it's called in the military, would be in Fort Hood, Texas. Now, according to the military records, Corll's service was, quote, unblemished, end quote. But, Corll, he hated being in the military. I mean, hated it with everything in him. And so he actually applied for a hardship discharge on the grounds that his mother needed his help to run the candy business. What the hell? I mean, really? I'm not sure why they granted his request. I'm not even sure why they looked at it, to be honest. They grant this thing, and they let him go with honorable discharge on June 11th of 1965, after only serving 10 months. I mean, why honorable? I mean, why discharge him at all? But why an honorable discharge? I really wish that I could talk to my father-in-law about these things, because he would have the answer. But anyway, he's got the honorable discharge, and he moves back to Houston, and they're in Houston Heights now, and he just falls back into his position of VP for the family business. And a couple of military men would kind of start talking at this time about him, okay? And there's records where they said that they noticed that in the presence of young teenage men, that he would act a certain way, leading them, the other servicemen, to believe that maybe he was homosexual. And so, yeah, the cracks, they're starting to show with this guy, right? First we have the boy that mom had fired, and now fellow servicemen are noticing, something was a little off with this dude. They're talking. Okay. Now, the candy business. So, when Mary and Jake got their divorce, Jake actually retained ownership of the Pecan Prince, which is probably why Mary had to change the business name to Corll Candy Company. Well, the two businesses would become fierce rivals, right? They are competing hard for this little niche going on with the candy. Well, the Corll's candy place, they would pull into the lead. So Corll, he would increase the number of hours that he spent on the business. And he was doing this to satisfy the growing business demands. And so as a result of the high demands and the great increase of cash, the family was able to buy a bigger and better shop that was located right across the street from an elementary school. So yeah. I mean, on one hand, that's great, right? Kids love candy, so business is bound to be successful. But now we have gone and taken us this predator and put him right across the street from an elementary school. So things are not going to be good moving forward. Now, Corll, he would oftentimes give candy out to the kids, earning him the name the Candyman, as well as the Pied Piper. And again, teenagers, they're hired to work, right? He would behave flirtatiously, it was said, towards the young male workers. Like he would also bring in a pool table to the back of the store, and it was placed there for the workers to, just kind of hang out and listen to music and play pool. Now, in 1967, Corll, he would befriend a 12-year-old boy named David Owen Brooks. Well, Brooks, he would become one of Corll's many, many young companions, regularly socializing with him and many other various teenage boys that would gather there at the candy store to hang out and play pool. Well, Corll would also take the young Brooks with him on trips. He would take him out to South Texas to hang out on the beach. Sometimes he'd take him to the movie. I mean, yeah, Brooks, he would later say that Corll was the first adult male who did not mock his appearance, and that whenever he needed cash or some kind of help, that Corll, he would help him, give him the money or whatever it is that the kid had asked for. So, yeah, Corll's definitely grooming this poor kid, and Brooks, he is not even aware of it, right? He's 12, so this is not good. Now, after a lot of, favors, given Brooks money and playing a father figure role in Brooks's life, the two, they would begin a sexual relationship, at the request of Corll, of course. And this would start in 1969. I mean, Corll's in like his 30s, okay? And this guy is barely going to be a teenager. Now, Corll, he would buy Brooks a lot of gifts or give him money, lots of cash, if he would let him, Corll, perform oral sex on him. These things are really sad. I mean, these kids start out with a rough upbringing, and someone comes along and treats them good, and then this kindness and these good deeds, they come with a real hefty price, and it's just sad that these kids get drawn into this madness. Now, Corll's mom, Mary, she and her daughter Joyce, they had actually relocated to Colorado after Mary's third divorce, and by this time too, the candy business, it is starting to fail. And so in 1968, Corll would stay in contact with his mother, but once she moved, they never physically saw one another again. Now, just before the door closed with the family's business, Corll got another job. So there's not a lot on the situation of how the candy business began failing. I mean, they were doing so well, making a ton of money, and now all of a sudden it's failing. So, but I guess, he's aware of what's happening with the family business. And so before it shuts down, he actually starts looking for work and takes a job with the Houston Lighting and Power Company, or HL&P as it's known. And here he would test relay systems. He would rise to be a supervisor in this position, and he would hold that until his death in August of 73. probably some of that military training that he hated so damn much can be accredited to that job that he got. In 1970, a whole lot of young boys would just start to disappear, most of which were from the low-income neighborhood called Houston Heights. The majority of these young boys were just teenagers. Now, Corll, he would lure these young boys into one of his vehicles, typically offering them a ride or an invitation to a party, again, much like Gacy. So he would then take them to his apartment and get them drunk, maybe high, pop some pills, huff paint, and he would have them do this until they passed out, or he would literally trick them into handcuffs. Sound familiar? Yeah. And some of them were, of course, taken by force. Now, they were then stripped naked and tied to either his bed or a torture board. And once in these positions, they would be assaulted, beaten, and tortured for days on many occasions until they were eventually strangled or shot. The bodies would then be wrapped in plastic and buried in one of four places: his rented boat shed, Bolivar Peninsula, I believe, a woodland area near Lake Sam Rayburn, where his family actually owned a cabin, or another beach in Jefferson County. Now, in many cases, Corll would have the victims call their families or write them letters to say that he found jobs or they were gone fishing or whatever. And all of this stuff is done so that the parents' minds are eased, right? Get this letter, and it's all just to make them think that their sons are okay, that they're not runaways, and they definitely aren't missing. But the parents, some of them, they knew their kids pretty well. And the parents could tell that the letters were written under distress. They were in their kids' handwriting, but they could tell that something was wrong and that these letters didn't necessarily sound like their kid either. And so the parents, they weren't put at ease at all. So they would end up, reporting their kids missing. And during this time, Corll, he is also moving around a lot, like a lot. So if anyone were to catch up or catch on to him, he was never in one place for too long. Sometimes he'd be in the rented apartment for like a couple of weeks, even though he'd paid for, a month or two. He'd be there for a few weeks and then he would just pack it all up and move to the next spot. But he always stayed close to the Houston Heights area because, remember, it's low income, and of course, close to elementary schools. Now, we know all this not because Corll told us, but because his two accomplices would tell us. That's right, he had two young accomplices, and one of those would actually be Corll's killer. So, who were these kids? Well, the first accomplice is none other than the David Owen Brooks kid, the 12-year-old boy that we talked about earlier. Yeah, him. So the other boy is a 15-year-old named Elmer Wayne Henley. So we're going to take a look at each of them because that's really the only point of view that we have in this crazy case. Now, David Owen Brooks, he was born February 12th, 1955 in Houston, Texas. He is the second of two sons, and he was born to Henry Alton and Mary Brooks. Now, Brooks' parents, they would divorce when he was just 6 years old. And his mother, Mary, she was given full custody of the kids. So she took the kids and she had moved to Beaumont, which is the town about 85 miles from Houston. So Brooks' father, Henry, he stayed there in Houston with the boys visiting him like on holidays or vacations, that sort of thing. During that time, when he'd be visiting his father, he would also stay in contact with Corll. Now, Brooks' early years show us that he was somewhat of a petty thief. On one occasion, he was actually caught stealing a potbelly stove. Like, what the hell was he going to do with a potbelly stove? Maybe they were cold. I don't know. But anyway, the officer that was investigating that thing, and caught up with Brooks and all that, he had suggested or recommended rather to Brooks's mom that maybe the boy would be better off in Houston, implying that, he needed his father's influence and guidance. So his mother agrees with this officer, and Brooks is then sent back to Houston in 1970. He was 15 at this time. He would only see his mom a few times after the move. Brooks didn't have a great relationship with his dad, and Brooks had told his attorney, once all of this came out that his dad, quote, didn't really like him, end quote. He felt that he was too sickly, looked too girly because he had long hair, and so he didn't really like him. That's awful way for a kid to feel. But anyways, Brooks, he did okay in school, usually achieving A's, B's, and C's for grades. Well, until he began attending Hamilton Junior High. Now, by this time, he was ditching and not interested in an education, and his grades would fall to D's and F's. Now, he would enroll in Waltrip High School, but dropped out after just 1 year. And remember, he had met Corll earlier, so this relationship was already established when the crimes were discovered and the investigators were talking to the two accomplices. Now, Brooks, he recalled his initial impressions of Corll, and this is what he said, quote, he would give candy to the kids leaving school, which was across the street from the store. Also, he owned a motorcycle and would give us rides and take some of us kids to the movies, end quote. He would also say that because he had such a bad relationship with his dad and they couldn't get along very well, that he would oftentimes end up at Corll's house, kind of seek refuge from his father. And so he would end up calling Corll's house his, quote, second home, end quote. In 1969, as I mentioned, the sexual relationship would start to develop between the two, and Corll would pay Brooks up to $10, and that's about $87 in today's money, or, the gifts that we talked about earlier. Well, Brooks would say that, quote, it was always Dean doing something to me, never me doing anything to Dean, end quote. Now, Brooks also said that he started becoming aware that he wasn't the only one involved in these sex acts. There were a lot of other young boys, and he told the investigators, quote, he liked oral sex, and he'd pay boys to come over and let him do it to them. That was his sex life, end quote. One day in November of 1970, Brooks, he went to one of Corll's apartments unannounced, and he walked in on Corll nude with two teenage boys that Brooks, well, he didn't know these kids, right? And that they were, quote, strapped down, end quote, to the bed. Now, Corll, he's irate and somewhat startled. He asked Brooks, quote, what are you doing here, end quote. And Brooks, he asked him the same question, like, what are you doing here? Like, what are you doing? Have kids tied down. What are you doing? So that kind of thing. Well, Corll, he tells him, quote, I'm just having some fun, end quote. Well, the two, Brooks and Corll, they would sit down and actually have a conversation about what Brooks had walked in on. And Corll, he was clearly trying to make sure that Brooks kept his mouth shut, right? He did not want him talking about this situation. So Brooks, he agreed not to tell. He left the apartment and hitchhiked back to his father's house. He never told anyone about what he had just, witnessed until after the arrests are made. Now, shortly after this incident, Corll, he would tell Brooks that Corll, was being paid to send the boys he saw strapped to the bed that day to California, and there to pose for pornographic photographs that were going to be published in a gay magazine. He would also promise Brooks a car in return for his continued silence. Brooks, well, he accepts this offer, and Corll buys him a 1969 Chevy Corvette. Yeah, for his 16th birthday. I mean, that's one hell of a gift for a 16-year-old kid, huh? Now, when anyone would ask where or how Brooke acquired this car, he would say, quote, I just scratched pennies for years, end quote. The hell? I've been scratching pennies for 52 and I don't have a Corvette, okay? A kid with no real job just comes up with a Corvette and no one's wondering about it. But now Brooks, he's going to find out that he is in this now real deep, okay? So far, we've seen that Corll is doing some real messed up stuff with kids, and that Corll is also buying Brooks' silence with money in the car and things. The situation's about to get a whole lot worse moving forward. It would be either November or December of 1970 that Corll tells Brooks that those two kids that he saw tied to the bed had actually been killed. He also tells Brooks that if Brooks, would bring him, Corll, some more boys, young boys, that is, that he would pay him $200 per kid. And ladies and gentlemen, that is $1,600 today. Ends up accepting this offer. So December 13th, 1970, two 14-year-old boys, James Glass and Danny Yates, they were attending a religious rally when Brooks lured them away into Corll's apartment. They obviously were never seen again. They would later be found buried in Corll's boat shed with an electrical cord and alligator clips buried alongside Yates' body. January 30th, 1971, Brooks and Corll come across two brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop. Now, Corll, he would assault them both and strangle them to death. Brooks would help Corll bury their bodies again in the boat shed. Now, 5 weeks later, on March 9th, 15-year-old Randall Harvey, he was last seen alive on his bike riding to his part-time job. He was taken back to Corll's apartment and killed by a single gunshot wound to the eye. The boy had actually known Brooks. And Brooks apparently had reported Randall for stealing his stereo or something to the police. So maybe there was like some bad blood there or something. And Brooks thought, oh, it's not gonna bother me if this one is taken to Corll. Now, between May and August of 71, Corll abducted and murdered at least 4 more victims. 3 of them lived in the Houston Heights area. Brooks assisted with the abduction and burials. All 4 were buried in the boat shed. Now, 2 of these victims were 13-year-old David Hilligist and 16-year-old Gregory Winkle. They were abducted and killed together on May 29th. Both were violently assaulted and tortured before being buried in the boathouse. And the mother of Hilligist, his first name is David, a boy by the name of Elmer Wayne Henley, and her son David, our victim, were good friends, lifelong friends. They'd known each other since like kindergarten or before. Wayne, he was helping put up missing persons posters looking for David. He was very worried about his friend, and they're, frantically searching. The police are doing nothing. They're just assuming that he is a runaway, as they often do in this time period. So no investigation was happening. It was up to the parents to basically find their kids. This kid, Wayne, he's helping, desperately searching for his good friend David. July 1st, 17-year-old Donald Falcon, he disappears. August 17th, 17-year-old Reuben Willard, he went to Corll's apartment for a party. Now, he knew both Brooks and Corll and had hung out with them before. So he goes to this party, calls his mom to let him know that he's spending the night with Brooks. He was later gagged, assaulted, tortured, and eventually strangled before being buried in the boat shed. Brooks obviously isn't looked at for this, and if he is, then there's no account of it. Now, one more victim is known to have been abducted in 1971, but this victim remains unidentified, and this was in October of 71. Now, according to Brooks' confession, this murder took place, quote, just before Henley comes into the picture, end quote. Brooks also said that Corll kept this kid in his apartment for about 4 days. 4 days before killing him. So here is what Brooks actually said on it, and it's, God help me, quote, just before Wayne Elmer Henley came into the picture, Dean kept this boy around the house for about 4 days before he killed him. I don't remember his name, but we picked him up on the 11th and Rutland. It really upset Dean to have to kill this boy because he really liked him, end quote. What? God. So we know that Corll had roped Brooke into this insanity, but now we need to know how he gets the other young man, well, Elmer Wayne Henley, because we talked about him helping distribute the missing persons posters for his friend, David. Now, Brooks and Henley, they would actually meet while both ditching school. Brooks had asked Henley if he too was ditching. Henley says yes. Brooks is like keeping pace with Henley and just jibber jabbering away, while they're walking towards the pool hall. And Brooks says, I'm just going to hang out with you then. Like, they're total strangers, but I'm going to hang out with you. So This is how they meet. And moving forward, the two would do this often. Now, Henley, he seems to be the total opposite of Brooks. Henley has a lot of friends. He's very sociable. Total opposite, right? He's outgoing. He's friendly. He has a job. He's knows everybody in the neighborhood. I mean, he's just an all-around good kid, where Brooks is to himself. He's quiet. He's shy. He's not, this outgoing individual. But while they're kind of feeling each other out, Brooks, he's also learning that Henley comes from a broken home, doesn't have much money, and that, he has two part-time jobs to kind of help his mom with the household bills and, putting food on the table, that sort of thing. Well, Brooks is gathering like all of this information through his observations. Henley is also gathering information on his newfound friend, Brooks. Now, Hensley, he notices that Brooks always seems to have some cash, right? Although he has no job to speak of. So he's curious, right? Like, you slinging drugs? What are you doing? So once Brooks gains Henley's trust, then he wants to introduce him to his longtime good friend, Dean Corll. Corll and Brooks, they would soon start hanging out with Henley at his workplace. So while Henley's working away, these two asshats are sitting around having conversation with him, getting to know him and all. Henley, he's only 15 years old at this time, and he liked Brooks and Corll. He started to look up to Corll, saying that, quote, he worked hard and seemed to have his life together, end quote. But he also said that Henley, thought that Corll might be homosexual and was starting to wonder if Brooks was making his money because he was, quote, hustling himself as a queer, end quote. Now, weeks later, Brooks told Henley that if he could leave his home without telling anyone where he was going, that he and Corll would pick him up behind the Methodist church at 5 p.m. sharp. Now, they would then, quote, discuss a deal where Henley, could make some money, end quote. Well, Henley, he agrees, and the pair pick him up at the agreed time and location, and they all go to Corll's house. Now, the real plan here was to make Henley Corll's next victim. I mean, Brooks clearly doesn't know how to be a good friend. That's what I'm gathering. You don't hang out with somebody for all this time and then just take them to deliver them to this sociopath that you know is going to end up killing them after God only knows what, for God only knows how long. Don't tell anybody where you're going. Don't tell anybody who you're with. That's why they didn't want him to tell, okay? Because he was supposed to be a victim. Well, Henley, he's not dumb. Kind of walks into this place feeling like something's not right. He got the little feeling in his stomach that, and maybe it was because Corll's standing there going on about how you need to keep your mouth shut while he's sharpening a knife. I mean, that might have scared the 15-year-old, who knows? But either way, he's asked, does anyone know where you are? And Henley's like, well, I told my mom, like, that I was with you, but I didn't tell her where we were going because I didn't know where we were going. But yeah, I told my mom. Knowing this, Brooks, he immediately just gets Henley and he drives his ass right back home, right? So, strike out there. But we're wondering, right? Well, how did this then turn into a three-way thing if Henley was supposed to be a victim? Well, here's how. So Brooks, remember, is not at all like Henley when it comes to people. Henley is very sociable, Brooks is not. And so Corll, he starts thinking that because Henley is the complete opposite of Brooks, that maybe Henley would actually make a better accomplice, right? He can get more kids, better looking ones. Discuss this, and they decide, yeah, we'll bring him in, but they would initially tell Henley that he was some bigwig in an organized theft ring, and that, they would end up actually robbing a couple of these businesses to kind of sell the story to Henley that this is what they were doing and where they were getting their money, okay? So it's all just a ruse, really. He had no interest in robbing businesses, but he needed Henley to believe that that's what he was getting himself into. Well, on one of these particular stakeouts, Corll says to Henley, quote, it's too bad there's not a market for people. They're everywhere, end quote. Corll, he would continue to bring this up all the time, this human trafficking thing, and eventually says to Henley, quote, such a market does exist, end quote. He tells him that the operation is based out of Dallas, in which teenage boys were sold as, quote, houseboys, end quote, to wealthy middle-aged clients across the country, and that he would give him, Henley, $200 for any teenage boy he could lure to his apartment. Now, Corll referred to this organization as, quote, the syndicate, end quote. And that's another thing that Gacy would tell these kids is part of this damn syndicate thing. So again, we have more similarities lining up between these two nut jobs. In February or March of 1972, Henley, he decided that he would, quote, help find a boy, end quote, for Corll to sell to this syndicate because, his family, they were really in dire straits. They didn't have any food to eat. There really wasn't a dime to their name. Henley, he agrees to find just one boy, right? Just one to get this money to help his family. He would say that he did it, quote, to get better things for my family. So one day I went over to Dean's place on Schuler Street and told him I would get a boy. Can you even imagine, though, being so desperate to help your family at 15 years old that you would even consider something like this? Well, as soon as Henley agreed, he and Corll actually jumped in Corll's car, like no time like the present, right? The hell? They start driving around the heights looking for a boy, and it wouldn't be long before one was found. So Henley, he persuaded this unknown youth with long dark hair into the car with the promise of smoking some weed back at Corll's apartment. Now, before the two had gone to find a victim, Corll had told Henley that once they got a boy, they would bring him back to the apartment and Henley would show the boy a trick with the handcuffs. And like last week's story, Henley, he would put the handcuffs on himself and then magically free himself, having that key hidden in his hand or pocket, just like Gacy. And then the boy would want to try the trick, okay? The boy would then, put the handcuffs on himself. And Henley, he says that that's when he saw Corll pounce on the boy, bind his hands and feet with cord, and place tape over his mouth. Brooks then drove Henley home, telling him that the syndicate was coming to get the boy, and that they, Brooks and Corll, had not informed the syndicate about recruiting Henley. So it was just better that he not be there, when the syndicate came. So takes Henley home. Now, the next day, Corll, he did pay Henley the $200, telling him that the boy had been sold into, quote, sex slavery ring, end quote. Can you imagine being part of something like this at any age, but for real, 15? 1 month later, on March 24th, the three ran into an old acquaintance of Henley. His name is Frank Aguirre. Now, he is 18 years old, and he was promised some weed and beer. They all go back to Corll's apartment, smoke some weed, do a little drinking, and Frank, he sees the handcuffs on the table there. Like Corll had deliberately left them out so that this kid would ask about them, and then they could therefore do the trick. Corll, he pounces on him, cuffing his hands behind his back, and drags him to the bedroom. Now, because Henley knew this kid, he would ask Corll not to sell him, right? He's like, he's my friend. Please don't sell him. Like, that's not why I brought him here. I don't want him sold off. Corll then tells him that, quote, I have assaulted, tortured, and killed all the boys before him, including the ones you've assisted in, end quote. And I'm sure the world went black in that moment. 15 years old, and you're being told, oh, by the way, you're an accomplice. Anyways, Brooks, he would then drive Henley home. The following day, Henley, he would assist the other two in burying his friend. This body was buried at High Island Beach. Now, despite knowing the truth now, Henley, he would continue to assist Brooks and Corll in the abductions and murders. Brooks would later say, quote, most of the killings that occurred after Henley came into the picture involved all three of us. I still did not take part in the actual killing, but nearly always all three of us were there, end quote. I don't know if that's supposed to make it better. Like, he's there watching. He's not trying to help these kids. He's bringing these kids knowing that they are not going to leave this place alive. And somehow what he's doing is better because he's not actually killing them. He would also say, quote, "It didn't bother me to see the victims restrained, tortured, assaulted, and murdered," end quote. I mean, what? This kid is way messed up. And he's been groomed by Corll, to be fair, since he was 12 years old, but what the hell? Now, Henley, his main role was to help with the abduction and burials and to, quote, help if something went wrong, end quote. Brooks, he would also say that, quote, Henley actively participated in the abuse and torture of the victims and was especially sadistic at the Schuler Street apartment, end quote. Moving on, though, less than a month later, 17-year-old Mark Scott would be captured and violently attacked like all the others before him. Now, Scott, he was also well known to the three, so he knew all three of them, Brooks, Henley, and Corll, and he was specifically chosen by Corll. Now, Corll had apparently told the two boys, Brooks and Henley, that Scott recently cheated him on a deal. Talking about some kind of like stolen goods deal or something. So on April 20th, Scott was lured to the apartment. Now, Scott, he fought like hell. I mean, according to the statements we have, he really put up one hell of a fight. And Brooks and Corll were having a very, very difficult time, like getting Scott subdued, right? So he would even try to like stab Corll with a small knife that he had. Scott, quote, gave up, end quote, only when Henley pointed a .22 caliber pistol towards him. Now, Brooks would also say that, quote, Wayne killed Mark Scott, and I think he strangled him, end quote. May 21st, Henley, he is summoned to the apartment by either Dean or Corll or Brooks, okay? And when he got there, he saw these two boys, 17-year-old Billy Baluch Jr., hope I'm saying that right, and Johnny Dolores, just 16 years old. Now, they were talking with both Brooks and Corll, so once there, Henley, he helped them overpower the two boys, and they were then bound to Corll's bed. Both were forced to write letters to their parents claiming that they had found work for, quote, a trucker. It was a loading and unloading job from Houston to Washington, end quote. Corll, he would then begin his torture and assault. Brooks would say, quote, once they were on the board, they were good as dead. It was all over, but the sounds of the shouting and crying, end quote. Brooks would also say that Henley strangled Belush to death with the process lasting about 30 minutes. He would also say that he, Brooks, was trying to divert the other boy's attention by talking to him, because I'm sure that's going to fucking work, right? You trying to distract this kid. His friend is being murdered and assaulted in front of him, and you're trying to distract him with conversation. Brooks said that Henley then shouted, quote, hey, Johnny, end quote, and shot him once in the forehead with the .22. The bullet would exit through his ear, and the boy would begin pleading with Henley, saying, quote, Wayne, please don't, end quote. He was then strangled, and both were buried at the High Island Beach. So between June 26th and November 16th of 1972, Corll had two apartments at a place called Westcott Towers. Now, at least 5 victims were abducted, tortured, assaulted, and eventually murdered at these places and then buried in the boat shed. They were all teenagers ranging from 17 to 19. 2 of them were 17-year-old Stephen Sickman and 19-year-old Roy Bunton. In these 2 cases, it is unknown if Brooks and Henley were involved with the abduction and murder of these 2. I don't know how they came up with this unknown thing. I mean, remember that Corll wasn't caught by law enforcement, so all these details are coming from Brooks and Henley. So if these 2 boys are giving out names and dates, then and where they're buried, then one or both of these guys had to be involved, right? I mean, again, no real case file, so what you do read, you're like, well, what? Yeah, what the hell? Anyway. On October 3rd, Henley and Brooks, they abducted 2 other young boys, and they were enticed into Brooks' car, and driven to Corll's, like many times before. Now, these boys, they were Wally, age 14, and Richard, just 13. Now, Brooks described them as, quote, both young boys were from the Heights area, end quote. 14-year-old Wally, he was able to get on the phone to his mom and was only able to shout, quote, "Mama," end quote. Yeah, he was only able to shout "Mama" into the receiver before the call was terminated. According to Brooks, the boys were on their torture board and that Henley accidentally shot one of the boys in the jaw. However, the two were kept alive and later strangled and buried in the boat shed. A month later, on November 11th, 19-year-old Richard, he was abducted while walking to a payphone. His body was found buried at High Island Beach. Later in November, 18-year-old Willard disappeared while hitchhiking to Houston. This young boy, he was emasculated and shot once above the ear before being buried in the boat shed. On February 3rd, 1973, Corll abducted 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. Now, Lyles actually knew both Corll and Brooks from several months prior to this. He actually lived on the same street as Brooks in 1973, so these two knew each other a long time. Now, according to Brooks, Corll wanted him, Brooks, to help him with this kid, to help restrain him, and Brooks refused. Well, Corll, he was able to grab, overpower, and bound Lyle on his own, and Brooks quickly left the apartment. Now, Lyle's body was later buried in a sandbank at Jefferson County Beach. On March 19th of 73, Corll, he would move to 2020 Lamar Drive in Pasadena, Texas. Now, this was his father's former house, I guess. I guess Dad owned it, and I don't know where Dad was, but now both Brooks and Henley, they would testify that at this residence, the level of brutality would greatly increase. I can't imagine that it would get any worse, but apparently it can, and it does. And Henley, he also senses that Corll was, quote, increasingly losing his sense of control, end quote. I'm not sure that he had any control over anything that we've gone over so far. Like, the dude he's a sadist. And Corll, he was becoming suspicious of the two accomplices. In addition to this, Brooks was also dating a young girl named Bridget. And by March, the two found out that she was pregnant, so they get engaged, Brooks and Bridget. Now, as a result of this, Brooks would start spending, more time with Bridget, and by the spring of 73, Henley found himself as, the primary accomplice to Corll's shenanigans here. So he's still helping him with the abducting and all the other awful stuff happening with these victims until early July. Now, Brooks, however, did continue to assist the pair in other crimes. So I don't know what else they were involved in. No case file. But Brooks apparently was not helping with the abduction and burials anymore. Now, on Monday, June 4th, 1973, Corll ordered Henley to, quote, bring him a boy, end quote. So Henley lured 15-year-old William Lawrence to Corll's home, promising the boy a fishing trip with him and Corll at Lake Sam Rayburn in Augustine County. Now, Lawrence, he called his father, saying, quote, some friends are taking me fishing. We'll be back in 2 or 3 days, maybe Thursday, end quote. Apparently, Corll really, quote, liked this boy, end quote, and kept him alive for 3 days, bound to Corll's bed. Now, Brooks did not help with the abduction, but he had seen the boy restrained at Corll's house the same day that the other two had abducted him. Okay, so he was present. And over that course of 3 days of abuse and torture, the young boy was strangled to death with a ligature. Corll and Brooks then took the body to Lake Sam Rayburn the following evening to bury him. Henley, keeping a lookout. So though Brooks says he didn't participate in the abduction or the murder, he was there and saw the kid and knew nothing was good happening there. And then he and Corll
buried the young boy while Henley was the lookout. So 11 days after Lawrence's abduction, a 20-year-old married man named Raymond Blackburn, he disappeared while hitchhiking to Louisiana. Now, he was on his way to Louisiana to see his wife and newborn child. Brooks would later confess to entering the house, quote, just after, end quote, Corll had strangled the young man to death. Brooks would also assist both Henley and Corll in the burial of him at Lake Sam Rayburn. July 7th, a 15-year-old boy named Homer Garcia, I think, called his mother, and that was to say that he was spending the night with a friend that he had met from driving school. However, when his mother pressed the issue for a name of this friend, the boy wouldn't give it. Yeah, wouldn't give the name of the friend. So the boy was shot in the head and chest and left in Corll's bathtub to bleed out. The trio then buried his body at Lake Sam Rayburn. His death was followed by 17-year-old John Sellers. He was a U.S. Marine. He was also shot to death with a rifle and buried at High Island Beach. Now, Sellers' car was set on fire and later found at Starks, Louisiana. And a side note there, according to things I can see on the trial, they weren't exactly sure if Sellers was actually a victim of Corll's. Like, didn't really match the previous MO. Like, a lot of the telltale signs of Corll's crimes weren't the telltale things present with this young man. So, questionable. Anywho, it was accredited to him, but there was some doubt. Now, on July 13th, Brooks married his pregnant girlfriend, Bridget, and the two, they got a place of their own. So Henley again finds himself as Corll's sole accomplice, assisting in the abduction and murder of 3 more teenage boys between July 19th and July 25th. Now, Henley would claim that these 3 were the only 3 that happened when he became the sole accomplice. So one of these victims was 15-year-old Michael Belange. Now, that name sounds familiar because he was the younger brother of a previous victim, Billy. Yeah, so this bastard took both this family's sons. Not that one's okay, but what the hell. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. The other 2 were Charles Cobble and Marty Jones. Now, they were taken together on the afternoon of July 25th. 2 days after their abduction, Jones was strangled to death with a cord while Cobble was forced to watch his best friend being murdered. Yeah. While watching this, he apparently went into cardiac arrest. And Henley was trying to assist Cobble when Corll ordered him to stop. I guess he was trying to give him CPR or something. And then he was shot and killed. I mean, there really is a lot more to the story, and we'll get into it in a little bit, okay, when we're going through court crap. But Henley would bury both of these boys in the boat shed. Now, the final murder was on August 3rd, with the help of Brooks, not Henley. Henley was out of town this weekend, so it's Brooks and Corll on this one. And the young victim was 13-year-old James Stanton. Corll encountered this boy while he was out riding his bike. And he lures this kid to the house to collect some glass bottles that the boy could then exchange for some cash, right? Doing the deposit on these glass bottles. And the kid was trying to get enough money. He's 13, and he has his first little girlfriend, and so he's trying to get enough money together to buy her something, okay? God bless him. Well, Brooks saw this boy at Corll's house before the murder, and he shared a pizza with this boy, right? So Brooks sees him, gets a pizza, shares the pizza with this kid. They're talking and, getting to know each other. And it seems that this kid really likes Brooks. He thinks he's a nice guy. Yeah, well, Brooks, he leaves him alone with Corll. And yeah, the boy was tied to the torture board. He was assaulted, tortured, assaulted again until he was strangled. He's then buried in the boat shed. I mean, on the morning of August 8th, 1973, Henley would shoot Dean Corll to death in the act of self-defense. and he then calls the police. And when the police arrive, they enter the house to find Corll shot dead in the hallway, naked, and they begin asking what happened. And Henley would begin to tell them what happened the night before on August 7th. He tells them that he and his friend, 20-year-old Timothy Curley, they were at Corll's house to attend a party at Corll's Pasadena home. The two of them, Henley and Curley, they left for a little while before returning to the house with another friend, a girl named Rhonda Williams. She was just 15. Now, she and Henley had known each other for quite some time, and she was having a real difficult time with her father this particular night. And so she was just going to pack an overnight bag to get away from her dad and let him sober up and calm down from whatever the hell was bugging him. And so, like, well, you can come and hang out with us, right? Completely thinking that this was safe, right? Because she's a girl and, no issue, right? Well, they go to Corll's, the three of them, and now Corll, he is real upset, okay? I mean, real upset that Henley brought a girl back, right? Because a girl has never been brought to the house before. Corll has no interest in girls, and he's real upset with Henley for bringing her. So Corll, he pulls Henley to the side and he told him, quote, "You ruined everything," end quote. But then Corll seemed to kind of calm down over the matter, right? Just kind of like, roll it off of his shoulders, right? And they all start drinking and smoking weed, and Henley and Curley, they're also, huffing some paint, because that's always a good idea. And they're getting real messed up. I mean, real messed up. And Corll, he just kind of goes to bed. He's encouraging them to keep on partying. He's just going to go to bed. Yeah. Well, it's now around 5:30 in the morning on August 8th. Henley, Curley, and the young Rhonda, they're all passed out. And, passed out, like, not asleep, guys. They're passed out from everything they had done. The booze, the weed, the puffing paint, the pills, all of it. They're passed out cold. They wake up. Well, Henley, he wakes up. He's discovered that he is tied up, right? And looks over at Curley and Rhonda there, and they are also restrained. And Curley is now naked. Henley, he's starting to kind of come to his senses a little bit, realizing like, whoa, shit, I'm in the restraints. That's not good. And so the two, he and Corll, are kind of, having a conversation here, and he tells Henley, quote, "Man, you blew it bringing a girl," end quote. He then shouts at Henley, quote, "I'm going to kill you all, but first I'm going to have my fun," end quote. Holy shit. Now, it's about this time that the other two are starting to come out of their drug-induced haze, and they are trying to also free themselves from the restraints they've found themselves in. Well, Corll, he drags Henley into the kitchen, and Corll pulls a pistol on him, right, shoving it in his gut, right in his stomach, and he's telling Henley, that he's going to kill him. Well, Henley, he starts talking to Corll, saying, well, just release me. Like, I'm sorry, man, just release me. I will torture, assault, and kill the chick while you, do what you do with Curley. Like, I'm cool with that. Just let me out of these here restraints here, and we'll just do this together. And so after, 30 minutes of this back and forth between the two, Corll agrees, and he frees Henley. Now, Corll then goes over to Rhonda, and he starts just kicking the shit out of her in the chest and in the stomach, screaming, "Wake up, bitch, wake up." And Henley and Corll, they take the pair into the bedroom one at a time, and they place a radio between them, turning the volume up to its highest point to mask any screams that are about to start happening. It's not a question. Shit's about to go sideways real bad here. Well, Rhonda, she looks over at Henley and she's like, quote, "Is this for real?" end quote. And Henley replies, "Yes." Now, as he's cutting off her clothes with this knife that he has because Corll told him to, she then says to him, quote, "Are you going to do anything about it?" end quote. Like, the fuck? You brought me over here, we're friends, and now I'm in this situation. Are you going to do anything about this? Like, what? So Henley, he's not doing so well with this whole scenario anymore, and he begins walking back and forth, pacing up and down, huffing some more paint, because that's probably going to fix everything. Well, Corll yells at him, quote, what are you waiting for, end quote. So Henley, he grabs the gun, he points it at Corll, saying, quote, "You've gone far enough, Dean. I can't go on any longer. I can't have you killing all of my friends," end quote. Well, Corll then climbs off of poor Curly, heads towards Henley, saying, quote, "You won't do it," end quote. Henley fires the gun, hitting Corll in the forehead, but the bullet doesn't penetrate the skull. Like, oh shit. And he continues to lunge forward and towards Henley. Now Henley, he fires 2 more shots, hitting him in the shoulder, penetrating his lung and his spine. Corll, he's coughing up blood, and he runs out of the room, trips over the telephone wire, and hits the wall. Henley then puts 3 more bullets in him. Corll slides down the wall, lay on the floor, naked and dead. Now, after Henley shot Corll, Curly began to cry and repeatedly thanked Henley for saving his life. As Henley freed his friends from the torture board, all 3 got dressed and started talking about, like, what they should do, right? Should we leave? Should we never speak of this again? Should we call the police? Like, what do we do? And Curly, he stated, quote, "We should call the police," end quote. So Henley agrees, and he placed the call to the Pasadena Police Department there in Texas, saying, that he had just shot a man in self-defense, which technically was true. Now, on August 8th, 1973, Henley called the police. Now, the call was received by the operator, a woman named Velma Lines, and on his call, Henley says, quote, "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man," end quote. And he gave her the address as 2020 Lamar Drive. The 3 would then wait outside of Corll's home there on the sidewalk, waiting for the police to arrive, and Henley says to the others, quote, "I've done that 4 or 5 times," end quote. Yeah. Minutes later, the police arrived to see the 3 sitting on the curb. Now, the 2, they were, quote, "weeping," end quote, while one was rocking back and forth, just staring blankly across the street. Henley identified himself, stating that he was the one that had killed the man and made the call to the police. He would also indicate to them where Corll's body was in the house. So the officers, they secure the weapon, and they place all 3 of the youth into a patrol car. Then he enters the house to find Corll's body in the hallway. The officer then read Henley his Miranda rights, and Henley, he shouted, quote, "I don't care who knows about it. I have to get it off my chest," end quote. Now Curly, he too is being questioned about, that morning's events. And Curly tells them that before they, the police, arrived, that Henley said to him, quote, "If you weren't my friend, I could have got $200 for you," end quote. The hell? Yeah. Well, the trio, they're in custody and being questioned about what had taken place. Now, Henley tells them all about the hours that led to the shooting, and that it was, self-defense. The story is corroborated by both Rhonda and Curly, and the officers do find that the shooting was in fact self-defense. Henley would also go on to explain that for almost 3 years he and Brooks had brought teenage boys to Corll who he had assaulted, tortured, and killed. Henley would say that initially he believed that the boys had been abducted, or that they had abducted rather, were sold into a Dallas-based organization for, quote, "homosexual acts, sodomy, maybe later killing," end quote. But he soon learned that Corll himself was killing the kids after assaulting and torturing them. Henley would also say that he had participated in the torture and mutilation of 6 or 8 victims prior to their murders, and most of them had been buried in Corll's boat shed, while others were buried at Lake Sam Rayburn and High Island Beach. Now, he also would say that Corll would pay him $200 per boy. Now, police, they don't really believe Henley at first, okay? They thought that they only had the killing of Corll to deal with, and that the incident was brought on by, quote, "drug-fueled fisticuffs," end quote. What the hell? Yeah, well, they're just saying, oh, they got into a little quarrel where they were all drugged up, and it turned deadly. But no, Henley, he was very insistent, and he shouted out the names of 3 boys that had been reported missing: Cobble, Hilligast, remember his friend, and Jones, stating that he and Brooks had taken these boys to Corll. So now he has the police's attention. Now, once the police actually went through Corll's home and found the floor covered in plastic and the torture board, as well as ropes, a large hunting knife, a portable radio rigged with dry cells to increase the volume, an electric motor with loose wires attached, a number of sex toys, thin glass tubes, and 8 pair of handcuffs, they thought that Henley might be telling the truth. What the hell? Why would a kid make that shit up, first of all? But anyways, they find all this stuff, right? Now, Henley, he agrees to take the police to Corll's boat shed there in southwest Houston. And that's where he claimed, that several of the bodies had been buried. And inside the boat shed, they would find, a half-stripped Camaro, a child's bike, a large iron drum, water containers, 2 sacks of lime, 2 shovels in the corner, a broken rake, and a large plastic bag full of teenage boys' clothing. Now, 2 prison trustees, poor guys, really, they're like, what? Yeah, different times, people. So they have these 2 prison trustees begin digging through the soft sand of the boat shed and soon uncovered the body of a blonde-haired teenage boy lying on his side, wrapped in clear plastic, and buried beneath a layer of lime. Jesus. Yeah, they picked the wrong day to have, work release, whatever it's called in jail. Poor dudes. So police, they continued to excavate the earth from the shed to find the remains of more victims in varying stages of decomposition. Yeah. Most of the victims were wrapped in plastic. Some were shot, others strangled with the ligatures still wrapped tightly around their necks. All of the victims had been sodomized and bore the evidence of sexual torture. Pubic hairs had been plucked out, genitals had been chewed on, objects had been inserted into their rectums, and glass rods had been inserted into the boys' parts. And then they're smashed. These glass tubes are then smashed. Yeah. Cloth rags had also been inserted into their mouths and tape wrapped around their faces to muffle their screams. Dear God. Hold on a minute. I need a little break from that. Yeah. What the hell is wrong with people? I mean, I gave you all that warning in the beginning, and it's sometimes that's just not enough. There's not enough words to warn you to this type of stuff. One of the victims' tongues protruded over an inch beyond natural margins. Another victim's upper and lower teeth were visible, leading the investigators to believe that this young boy died while screaming. Yeah. Listen, y'all, there's more, but I just can't. I can't get into it. You get the idea, okay? This guy was the worst sexual sadist I have ever looked into, and he did the most horrific things imaginable. Whatever it is that you think tops it, it doesn't. So, worse than worse, okay? And if you have to know what all the horrific details are, then feel free to go and look it up. Just Google away. But it's too much. I can't. So, anyway, there would end up being 17 bodies that were recovered from the boat shed. Now, Henley, he had told them that there were just 4. And it was reported that Henley was, quote, shocked, end quote, when he learned that there was actually 17 in there. The 4 he knew of for sure were there. And one of them was of his longest friend, little David Hilligast, that he had actually helped look for before he got involved in this whole mess. When he learned that Corll had actually taken Hilligast, Henley, he was told by Corll that Corll had sold him as a, quote, houseboy, end quote, and if Henley brought him, another boy, they might be willing to trade for Hilligast. Okay, so that's a little more backstory on how Henley got involved in this whole mess to begin with. So Henley thought, he thought on it for a few days, and then he agreed to bring Corll a boy, remember? And this was supposed to be in exchange for his lifelong friend, David Hilligist. Now, and the money that he was going to receive for this boy in exchange for Hilligist, that $200, was going to, remember, help his family. They were in dire straits. So that's a little more insight onto how Henley got involved in this whole mess. This is now what he's telling the police, okay? So Henley, he would help the police the entire time, like leading them to the bodies that were buried by him, Brooks, and Corll at the various locations mentioned earlier. Now, while Henley was giving full statements, Brooks was insisting that he hadn't killed anyone, right? He just helped get the boys to Corll and then assisted in the burials, but he never killed anyone. This is what he's saying. Now, although he would say things such as, quote, once the boy was on the board, they were good as dead. It was all over but the shouting and the screaming, end quote. Like, Jesus, doesn't sound like Brooks felt very bad about anything, Brooks would also say that, quote, it didn't bother me to see the boys die, end quote. Saying also, quote, I saw it many times, end quote. Good hell. Brooks would also agree to assist the police in finding the victims at High Island Beach. And by August 13th, the pair would have led the police to the location of 27 bodies. Yeah, the most in U.S. history at the time, until Gacy was later caught in 1978. Now, the families of the victims were highly critical of the Houston Police Department because these boys' disappearances weren't being taken seriously. No surprise. They were all listed as runaways and not looked for. Exactly like the Gacy case, right? Now, the Waldrop family, they lost both their sons to this sadistic lunatic, okay? And they had told the police that their sons wouldn't just run away, right? They had even told the police that an acquaintance of theirs, like a friend or somebody, had seen Corll burying what appeared to be a body at the boat shed. Now, on this particular report, the police did go to the boat shed and they looked around, like poked around there, just didn't really do much but walk around the damn boat shed, okay? And then they determined that there was nothing to find and that it was a hoax. Well, Mr. Waldrop, the boy's father, he kept going to the police station, and on one of those trips to the station, the police chief, the bigwig, he says, quote, why are you down here? You know your boys are runaways, end quote. I swear, I swear, I can feel my blood pressure rise when I go through this stuff. It's what the hell. Another victim, Gregory Winkle, his mother was also at the station a lot, trying to get them to take her seriously, right? And they would also tell her that her son is a runaway. Go home. She would reply to that saying, quote, you don't run away from home with nothing but a bathing suit and 80 cents, end quote. I mean, these poor parents, I can't imagine the sinking feeling of knowing that something is terribly wrong. The whole mother's instinct is very real. And so as a mom, I can't imagine getting that gut-wrenching feeling that something is wrong with my child. And I'm going to the police station, asking for their damn help because they're supposed to protect and serve, right? Okay, I need their service. I need them to help. And no help is offered. Like, these parents, they were only offered insults, not help, not compassion. They were not shown kindness. They were only shown the door, asking them to accept the, quote, facts, end quote, that their boys were runaways and absolutely nothing more was done. Yeah, the thing here is that the police, they didn't even solve the case, right? I mean, Henley killed Corll. He wasn't hunted and captured like others were, so if Henley hadn't called the police and told them the entire story, they wouldn't have had a clue, and Henley certainly, he didn't have to tell the truth, So they got lucky with him. They got lucky with him wanting to get it off of his chest, like clear his conscience. It wasn't good old-fashioned police work, okay? And to add to all this nonsense, while Henley and Brooks are leading police to the bodies, this piece of shit, Dean Corll, he's being buried with full military honors with an American flag draped over his coffin, and that really, really pisses me off. Like, what the hell? Yeah. So, the trials and the convictions of Henley and Brooks, they would start, and the two would be tried separately, of course. Now, Henley, he was brought to trial before Judge Dial in San Antonio, Texas, on July 1st of 1974. Now, he's charged with 6 murders between March of 72 and July of 73. Henley did not take the stand. His attorney, William Gray, did not call any witnesses or experts for his defense. But he did cross-examine, like, several of the other witnesses, okay? The prosecution called 24 witnesses to the stand, including Curly and Rhonda, the two that, were strapped to that board when Henley shot and killed Corll. So them. And they also would bring in, like, 82 pieces of evidence, including the torture board and one of the boxes used to transport the victim. So this box, it had hair in it, which was hair belonging to Cobble and to Henley himself. Now, the defense, again, called no witnesses. The attorney, it sounded like he just showed up, right? He isn't putting forth any kind of defense for Henley. And there's a reason that Henley's attorney isn't doing much. So he was actually offered a book deal, okay, on this whole situation. But the deal would only happen if Henley is convicted. So he's not trying real hard. I mean, what? Is that even legal? I mean, it doesn't matter. But is it? He was supposed to be given a fair trial, right? Anyway. So one witness to testify on Henley's involvement in these abductions and murders for the prosecution was a detective named David Mollison. He read a statement that Henley had written, and in one part of this long confession, Henley recalled 2 victims, Cobbles and Jones. Now, remember that I had said there was, more to their story? Okay, so in this confession, Henley wrote how he had lured the pair to Corll's Pasadena home and how Corll had sexually attacked them. Corll then put both boys on the torture board facing each other and told them they had to fight. Like, it's supposed to be a fight to the death situation, okay? And whichever boy, won this fight would then be let go and ultimately allowed to live. God help us. So, that's just how the scene is set. Now, the 2 friends, they would fight for several hours, both a bloody mess, fighting for their lives and pretty much trying to kill each other for their own life to be spared. Can't imagine being in this situation with my best friends, who I love very much, and I can't imagine us being in this awful predicament. Anyway, after they had spent several hours, beating each other up, Jones, he was tied to the board and forced to watch Cobble be assaulted, tortured, and then shot to death, before Jones himself was assaulted and tortured until he was strangled to death on July 27th, 1973. This actually took place 2 days after the boys were reported missing. So if the cops had looked into the missing, boys' reports that were filed, maybe if somebody had taken it seriously, maybe they could have been found and possibly saved. On July 15th of 74, both attorneys would present their closing arguments, and the prosecution was seeking life in prison and apologized for not being able to seek the death penalty, adding the case was, quote, the most extreme example of manslaughter, inhumanity to men I have ever seen, end quote. The defense was asking for a verdict of not guilty with no further explanation given. Just, find him not guilty. We'll run with that. The jury would only deliberate for 92 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all 6 of the murders that Henley was being charged with. He would be given 99 years for each life, bringing the total to 594 years. He was then transferred to Huntsville unit to formally begin his sentence. Now, Henley, he did appeal, arguing that his initial jury had been tainted, by news and media, and that his attorney's objection to news media present in the courtroom had been overruled, also citing that his defense team's attempts to present evidence contending that the trial should not be held in San Antonio, that had also been overturned by the judge. So Henley's appeal was upheld, and he was awarded a retrial, and this would be in December of 78. Now, his retrial would begin, held in Corpus Christi, Texas, and again, he would be represented by his attorney, William Gray, and now Edwin Peglow or something is assisting. So they would try again to have his written statements thrown out by the judge, which is now Noah Kennedy, but the judge was like, no, we're leaving them in. They're admissible evidence. So the retrial would last only 9 days, with his attorneys arguing that the evidence provided by the prosecution, quote, belonged to Dean Corll, not Elmer Wayne Henley, end quote. Again, calling no witnesses. And on June 27, 1979, after only deliberating for a little over 2 hours, the jury reached their verdict of guilty, and Henley would be resentenced to the 6 99-year terms, only to run concurrently this time rather than consecutively. Well, Henley, he is still in prison today serving the sentence, and he comes up for parole every few years, with the last one just being this past October 2025. His conviction so far has always been upheld. Now, Brooks. He was brought up to trial before Judge William Hattern in Houston, Texas on February 27, 1975, and he had been indicted on 4 murders that were committed between December 1970 and June of 73. But he was brought to trial charged with only 1 murder, and that was for the 15-year-old William Lawrence. Now, Brooks's attorney, Jim Skelton, he would argue that Brooks had not committed any murders and was trying to put it all on Corll and Henley. Now, the prosecution's attorney, Tommy Dunn, he would dismiss the defense's contention outright and had told the jury, quote, "Was he an innocent bystander? This defendant was in on this killing, this murderous rampage, from the very beginning. He tells you he was a cheerleader, if nothing else. That's what he was telling you about. With his presence, you know he was in on it," end quote. Brooks's attorney would begin his 40-minute closing argument saying that the state had based their entire case on circumstantial evidence, and that they had only proven Brooks to be an accessory to murder as opposed to murder itself, stating, quote, "The state has proven David Owen Brooks for being an accessory to murder. The state has not established a murder case. They have proved accessory to murder, not murder. Before you convict, you've got to find an act to punish," end quote. Brooks' trial lasted less than a week. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes, just like they had with Henley, and they came back with a guilty verdict for the murder of Lawrence on March 4th, 1975, and he was sentenced to life. Now, Brooks, he would appeal his sentence, stating that his signed confession was taken without him being informed of his legal rights, like no Miranda or something. But his appeal was dismissed in May of 79. Now, he would spend the rest of his days behind bars until his death in May of 2020. He died due to complications of COVID-19, and he is buried at the Captain Joe Bird Cemetery in Walker County. Now, to date, all of Corll's victims have been identified with the advancements of DNA, with the exception of one. He is referred to as, quote, John Houston Doe, end quote, and Swimsuit Boy. Yeah. There were also many misidentified victims, some of them only properly being identified in 2011. In 2022, authorities announced that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the Harris County Institute of Forensic Science are actively working together to identify this victim. They also updated the facial reconstruction in the media in August of 2023. Now, there were 42 boys that had vanished from the Houston Heights area between 1970 and 1973. But after the police had recovered 27 bodies, they literally just terminated the search for any further victims. I mean, it's widely believed that there are many more victims of corals still out there just waiting to be found. And I personally agree. I couldn't tell you, like, why they just stopped looking. It's like the police, had surpassed the highest mass murder count of Juan Corona, giving Texas now the worst mass murder title, and they just stopped. And then Gacy, he would pass Coral's body count with 33 to his name in December of 78. Henley, he did tell the police that they had missed 2 bodies. The police, they ignored him. Now, these were the remains of Scott and Lyles. The body of Scott still lies undiscovered at High Island Beach somewhere, and Lyle's remains were only found by chance in 1983. Had they continued to search for bodies, both victims would have been found. Now, after Hurricane Ike in 2008, the High Island Beach is submerged underwater, leaving more possible victims as well as Scott's body, with a strong possibility of never being found. Now, another interesting side note about there being many more victims is that many former employees from the candy shop, back in the day, they had recalled Corll digging in the years leading up to 1968. When the business was beginning to fail, he would just start digging holes all over the damn place, apparently. And some of these kids, they were asking, like, what are you digging all these holes for? And he would tell them that he was burying the candy that had spoiled to avoid contamination by insects. He also covered these holes with concrete. He was also digging in, quote, wastelands, end quote. This area is now a parking lot, also covered in concrete. Now, at this time, he also had huge rolls of plastic that, the very kind that he used in the murders to wrap the bodies, and employees from the lighting company also came forward and mentioned that Corll would always keep any leftover nylon rope, and that would, normally be thrown away. These little pieces of rope are worthless to the company. Well, this would be the same type of rope that was also used in the murders. So with all of this information, it is highly likely that Dean Corll started killing years before he had the help of Henley and Brooks, and that the murders probably started well before 1970. Now, also in 73, just 2 days after the case broke, John David Norman was discovered there in Dallas, Texas. Remember him from the Gacy case? Well, when they busted him, there was more than 10,000 index cards with names of those involved in this child sex trafficking ring. They found numerous teenage boys' details, their names, age, all of that, that were being trafficked in this ring. Now, in the process here, they would also find a man named Roy Ames in 1975. Now, he was actually out in California, and he was making pornography films with these young boys. Yeah. So the attention was actually brought on this dude. When Corll died, they found this guy's information in Corll's wallet. And so it took them a couple of years to catch up with this dude, but they did. And now, those 10,000 index cards that they found with John David Norman, the ones that had all the names of the people buying these young boys and the identity of the kids themselves, yeah, well, those would mysteriously disappear. Ain't that some shit? I mean, maybe there were a lot of bigwigs, city officials, men of power that knew of this list because maybe they were on the damn list. Who knows? But it is pretty damn suspicious that you would lose something of that magnitude and of that evidentiary importance, right? I mean, it's massive evidence. It doesn't make sense. Now, it's also thought that with the John David Norman connection between both Gacy and Corll, that maybe they knew each other, and maybe they did. But I'm starting to think that Gacy was actually a copycat killer to Dean Corll. You see, Corll's case, it was all over the news. And back in the day, they didn't sugarcoat the news. Like, they showed the bodies being dug up and close-ups of the bodies themselves. You know, they're in the boat shed. And they spared no details. I mean, everything that Henley and Brooks ever said was aired, uncensored. So they talked about the handcuff trick, the torture board, the sex toys, all of it. And Gacy, he had admitted to watching everything he could on the case, learning, absorbing it all, and then applying it, to his own craft. Well, if that's the case, then he definitely is a copycat killer. So Gacy had even bragged at one point that he had exceeded, Corll's body count. So he was definitely paying attention to Dean Corll. Yeah. And that, my twisted friends, is the awful, awful, twisted tale of Dean Corll the Candyman. Like, no one truly knows the actual body count, but I believe he has like 29 confirmed or attached to his name. He is the only one we know of that was not captured by police, but, taken out by one of his own people. So, like all before him, the police weren't even looking. They didn't have any idea that any of this was even happening. Again, the police, they weren't looking into the missing kids being reported by their parents, and because of that, a lot of these kids were robbed of their lives. And if Henley hadn't wanted to get all of this off of his chest, he could have just stuck to saying, he killed Dean in self-defense. The other two corroborate the story end of it, right? We would have never even known about Brooks and Henley's involvement, much less that they had a mass murderer running around killing all of these boys, and these parents would have never had any answers. So they could have walked away and suffered no consequences. But thankfully, Henley did come forward, and Brooks, got his too. Because really, those parents would have been left with nothing had they not. So Henley's kind of like the hero and the villain all at once in this one. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the similarities, between Gacy and Corll. Do you think he was a copycat to Corll? Or did they know each other? Interesting. Let me know in the comments who you'd like to have me cover in future episodes. And please be safe out there. Take care of yourselves. And I will see you all next Tuesday for another crazy twisted tale. Hopefully not as bad as this one. Y'all take care. Talk to you later. Bye, guys.